Her laughter, her perfume, her late nights, all painted lies I refused to see. Then, one night, a single text shattered it all. Side piece. Tony Fletcher, her perfect escape, wasn't just a coworker. He was chaos in disguise. I didn't lose control. I took it. Quietly. Strategically. Actions have consequences, I told myself as I uncovered his dirty secrets. She begged for forgiveness. He begged for mercy. But my plan? It left no room for either. Now, standing amid the ruins of our 23 years, I don't regret my revenge. Some betrayals demand justice delivered cold. Timothy Tim Wilson tapped his fingers on the kitchen counter, eyes fixed on the digital clock that read 7:47 p.m. The overhead light buzzed faintly. This was the third evening in a row Linda, his wife of 23 years, had come home late. His mind spun with possibilities: traffic, a work meeting, an emergency. But each explanation felt weaker than the last. He glanced at his phone, noticing how silent it had been. No text from Linda, no call. "Dad?" Emma's voice broke into his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, a towel slung over her shoulder. "Are you okay? You've been standing here for like 10 minutes. "I'm fine," Tim answered, forcing a smile. "Just waiting for your mom." Emma gave him a concerned look. She was a slender young woman, 23, with the same dark hair as Linda, but kinder eyes that seemed older than her age. Ever since she'd moved back home after finishing college courses online, Tim had come to rely on her calm presence. She read his hesitation. "Did she say she'd be late?" "Not exactly," Tim muttered. "You want some tea? I was about to make a cup." Emma nodded, stepping aside to let him pass. He poured water into the kettle, flicked on the electric switch, and busied himself finding 2 mugs. Steam soon hissed from the spout. The ritual gave him a moment to compose his thoughts. When Linda finally arrived, it was almost 8:20. She pushed the front door open, juggling a shoulder bag and her phone. Her face, lit by the dim hallway lamp, was flushed, either from the cold or something else. Tim couldn't decide. "Hey," she said breathlessly, brushing a strand of light brown hair from her forehead. "Sorry, I got caught up." Tim and Emma exchanged glances. Emma shrugged as if to say, "I've done all I can," and headed upstairs, leaving Tim to face Linda alone. He cleared his throat. "You missed dinner." Linda hung her bag on a coat hook and slipped off her heels. "I know. Look, I'm sorry. Tony, my coworker, wanted to discuss some stuff about a project. We lost track of time." This was the first time Tim heard that name. Tony. The way it rolled off her tongue, Tony felt oddly casual, intimate even. He tried to ignore the pinch in his chest. "So you were with Tony until just now?" She nodded, her expression momentarily guarded. "Yeah, we worked on the next phase for the marketing campaign." Tim inhaled, keeping his voice steady. "Linda, if you're going to be late, just let me know. I worry." Her shoulders relaxed. "Of course, it won't happen again." But her eyes flickered away as she spoke. In the following days, Tim began noticing more changes. Linda typed away on her phone with a small smile. She started wearing new clothes to work, a perfume Tim didn't recognize. All small details, but together they began to form a pattern he didn't like. At first, he told himself he was being paranoid. Marriages go through phases, he reasoned. People get wrapped up in new projects or new routines. But these reassurances did little to ease the tightness in his stomach. One chilly afternoon, Tim was in the driveway, struggling to set up a portable basketball hoop for his middle son, Dylan, who was visiting for the weekend. Dylan was 26, tall, quiet, with intense dark eyes that mirrored Tim's own. He offered Tim a reluctant hand with the clumsy metal poles. "How long's Mom been working on that campaign?" Dylan asked suddenly, squinting in the waning sunlight. Tim wiped sweat from his brow. "A few weeks, I think." "Why?" Dylan shrugged. "She's different. I don't know. She's just aloof, maybe." Tim paused, noticing how the threads of concern ran through Dylan's voice. "She's busy, but yeah, I sense it too." They said nothing more about it, returning to the clank and rattle of metal. But Tim's mind kept turning. A couple of days later, Linda asked Tim if it was okay to bring Tony by the house after work. He raised an eyebrow but agreed. Part of him wanted to meet this coworker, see if his suspicions were just the product of an overactive imagination. Tony Fletcher arrived in a black sedan with tinted windows. Stepping out, he offered Tim a wide grin. He was around 40 with slicked-back hair and a leather jacket that looked more club-ready than office-appropriate. "Hey, man," Tony greeted, extending a hand. "Thanks for letting me crash here while Linda grabs some files." Tim forced a polite smile, shaking Tony's hand. His grip was firm, a little too firm, as if Tony was trying to establish dominance. "No problem," Tim said. "Linda talks about the new campaign. Sounds exciting." Tony smirked. "Yeah, it's shaping up to be a major shift for the company." His gaze roamed around the living room walls. "Nice place you got." Linda came downstairs, a stack of folders tucked under her arm. "Tony, sorry for the wait. Ready to go?" She avoided Tim's eyes, ushering Tony out as quickly as they'd arrived. Tim closed the door slowly, every nerve in his body alive with a sense of foreboding. Emma emerged from the kitchen, biting her lip. "Dad, you okay?" He nodded, swallowing the bitter taste in his throat. "Yeah, I'm fine." Jacob, the oldest, was 28 and lived in another city with his fiancée, Sarah. He wasn't supposed to visit until the holiday season, but he called Tim one morning with a terse announcement. "I'm driving in tonight. We need to talk." Something in Jacob's tone made Tim's scalp prickle. Jacob was the most straightforward of his children. He never sugarcoated anything. That evening, Tim noticed a heaviness in Linda's demeanor. She kept glancing at the clock. "Jacob's coming?" she asked, stirring a pot of pasta. "Yeah," Tim replied. He sounded upset. She tensed, but said nothing further. Jacob arrived around 9 p.m., stepping inside with an air of urgency. He was broad-shouldered, wore a neatly pressed shirt, and had the determined look of someone ready for a confrontation. After hugging Tim, he turned to Linda. "Mom," he said curtly. Linda managed a tight smile. "Hi, sweetie. It's good to see you." They moved to the living room. Emma was upstairs. Dylan had driven back to his apartment earlier that day. Jacob waited until Tim sat down, then leaned forward. "I heard some rumors. People at Mom's office. They're talking." Linda stiffened. "Talking about what?" Jacob gave her a hard stare. "You and Tony." A deafening silence swallowed the room. Tim's heart pounded in his ears. The little details he'd been noticing crystallized into something far more real and far more terrifying. Linda's voice came out shaky but defiant. "What exactly are they saying?" Jacob pressed his lips into a thin line. "They're saying you two are involved, that you skip out on lunches together, spend late nights at the office, and people are starting to wonder if it's more than work." Tim felt his stomach drop. He turned to Linda, searching her face for denial, for some sign that this was all a misunderstanding. But Linda's eyes welled with tears. "That's ridiculous," she murmured. "Tony and I, he's just a coworker, a friend." Jacob snorted, running a hand through his short, dark hair. "Mom, this is exactly the kind of rumor you'd want to nip in the bud, but you're not even angry. You're just sad. You expect me to buy that nothing's going on?" Tim swallowed the knot in his throat. "Linda," he said quietly, "I want to believe you. But is there something you need to tell us?" She stood abruptly. "I can't believe you're both ganging up on me like this." Her eyes flashed. "I'm under a lot of stress. And Tony, he's a supportive colleague, that's all." Without another word, she strode upstairs, leaving father and son in thick silence. Jacob slumped back on the couch, looking exhausted. "Dad, I'm sorry. I'm just telling you what I've heard." Tim nodded, running a hand across his jaw. "I appreciate it. We'll figure this out." Tim didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his bed, occasionally checking his phone as if expecting Linda to send an explanation or apology from the next room. Nothing came. Instead, a hollow ache settled in his chest, pulsing like a bruise. By morning, Linda left early, claiming some urgent meeting. Tim found a note on the fridge in her neat cursive. "Went to the office. Let's talk when I get home." He stared at the note for a full minute. The phrase, "let's talk," repeated in his mind, hollow as an echo. Jacob was downstairs, rummaging through the fridge. He pulled out a carton of orange juice and poured himself a glass. "Dad, I'm sorry for barging in. I wanted to know if you were aware of all this. I hate people gossiping about our family. Tim sank into a chair at the kitchen table. I get it, son. Believe me, I'm not mad you came. Actually, I'm glad. Jacob hesitated, then spoke carefully. Sarah and we were talking about the possibility of you and Mom splitting. I don't want that to happen, but if she's doing something behind your back... Tim rubbed his eyes. The very idea made him nauseous. Let's not jump ahead, okay? I need to talk to your mom directly. That evening, Linda was out again some alleged dinner with clients. Tim paced the living room, the TV playing a rerun of a baseball game he had no interest in. His phone buzzed. It was from Linda's number, a text message. But as he opened it, he realized it was a conversation she was having with Tony, possibly sent to Tim by accident. Tony. What do you want from me, Linda? I can't stand being just a side piece. Linda. We'll figure it out. Tonight wasn't the right time. Tony. When will it be? I want this to be real. Tim's breath caught in his throat, and his hand shook, nearly dropping the phone. He read the messages again, each word slicing deeper into his gut. Side piece. I want this to be real. A few seconds later, Linda's number sent a frantic follow-up text. Linda. Tim, if you're reading this, please let me explain. He stared at his screen, numb. The partial confession was right there in black and white. Any illusions he'd clung to evaporated. Linda arrived home around 10:30 p.m., stepping inside to find Tim waiting in the living room. He turned off the TV, letting the silence stretch ominously. She stood across from him, tears forming in her eyes. Tim, let me. He held up his phone. I got your messages. Or rather, Tony's messages. Care to say anything? She opened her mouth, then closed it, looking like a cornered animal. I never meant for it to happen this way. It just Tony made me feel alive. We've been distant for a while, you and I. Tim's voice was low, trembling with anger he fought to suppress. So it's my fault? You needed to cheat because we were distant? Linda reached out, but Tim stepped back. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know this is horrible. I know it's the worst thing I could do. But Tony, it's not just a fling. I think I love him. His mind reeled. She'd said it. I love him. The final blow. He stared at her, trying to see the woman he married, the one who stood next to him at their wedding, glowing with joy. Now she was a stranger. He swallowed hard, forcing the next words out. Then why are you still here? If you love him, go. She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. I can't. I want to figure out how to make things right, but I also can't pretend I don't have these feelings. I don't know what to do. Fury and heartbreak warred within him. Finally, he turned away. You can stay in the guest room tonight. We'll talk more tomorrow. Without waiting for her response, he marched upstairs, leaving Linda crumpled against the sofa. Up in his bedroom, Tim slammed the door shut. His breathing came shallow, fists clenched. A swirl of thoughts battered him. Images of Linda laughing with Tony, possible times she'd lied about working late, the humiliating sense that all his colleagues or her colleagues might know. He needed to do something, anything, to take control. So he grabbed an old duffel bag from the closet and began shoving his clothes inside. He wasn't even sure why. Maybe he thought he'd leave first, strip her of that power. Or maybe he wanted to keep himself from doing something rash. But as he zipped the bag, the ring on his left hand glinted under the overhead light. He stared at it, remembering the day he'd slipped it onto Linda's finger, a promise to love and cherish her. That was more than 2 decades ago. Now everything was undone in a single text exchange. His phone buzzed. Another message from Linda. I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you like this. He threw the phone on the bed, ignoring it. He needed distance from her words, from her presence. Tim didn't sleep a wink. When dawn broke, he heard the faint clink of dishes downstairs. Emma must be up, or maybe Linda was trying to pretend everything was normal. He found Emma in the kitchen, hair in a messy bun, scrolling through her phone as she sipped coffee. She looked up. Dad, you look terrible. What happened last night? Tim slid into a chair, resting his arms on the table. He wasn't sure how much to tell Emma, but he also felt a surge of protectiveness. He didn't want her to blame herself or be blindsided. I found out your mom's been seeing someone else, he said carefully, voice raw. I've suspected for a while, but it's confirmed now. Emma's face went pale. She set her mug down, coffee sloshing onto the table. "Oh my God," she whispered, grabbing paper towels automatically. "Dad, I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" He shook his head. "No, but I will be. I don't know the next step." Emma's eyes brimmed with tears. She walked around the table and hugged him. Her arms around his shoulders made him realize just how shaky he felt. "I'm here for you," she whispered. "Whatever you need." Less than an hour later, Linda emerged, hair unkempt, eyes puffy from crying. She wore a bathrobe, looking so small and vulnerable that Tim almost felt pity. Almost. She tried to approach him. "Tim, can we talk?" Emma immediately excused herself, heading upstairs to give them privacy. Tim stood at the kitchen sink, gripping the counter. "If there's more to say than you said last night, go ahead." Linda began to speak, voice trembling. She explained how Tony made her feel understood, how it wasn't planned. She insisted she never wanted to break up the family. But Tim just stared at the faucet, the drip of water echoing through the silence. "Stop," he said finally, turning to face her. "Just stop. You did this. You made these choices." She looked away, tears glistening on her cheeks. "Yes, and I'll accept whatever consequences come my way." Tim's jaw clenched. He inhaled deeply, stepping back. "I need space. This house is half mine, but if you want to leave, then leave. I won't stop you. But if you stay, things can't go on like before." Linda stared at the tiled floor. "I'll stay in the guest room for now, at least until we figure out how to handle this with the kids." Tim felt a surge of emotion, anger, sorrow, disbelief. "Sure," he replied curtly. Then he walked out, not wanting to hear another word. Over the weekend, Jacob and Dylan both decided to visit, presumably because Emma had texted them about the situation. Tim felt a knot in his stomach when he saw Linda trying to put on a calm face at dinner, as if the four of them would just chat about everyday life. They sat around the dining table, plates of roast chicken and mashed potatoes in front of them. The tension was thick. Jacob glowered at Linda, while Dylan's gaze flicked uncertainly between his parents. Emma barely touched her food. Finally, Jacob broke the silence. "So, are we going to talk about the elephant in the room?" Linda pressed her lips together. Tim said nothing, letting Linda face the music. Emma cleared her throat. "Mom and Dad are having some issues." Jacob snorted. "Yeah, we know that. Issues being Mom is cheating on Dad." Dylan set down his fork, looking at Linda. "Is it true? Are you in love with someone else?" Linda's eyes brimmed with tears. "I can't deny I've made a huge mistake, but I never wanted to hurt your father. I still care about all of you." Jacob's fists tightened on the table. "You care about us? Is that why you've been sneaking around with Tony Fletcher?" "Jacob," Tim said softly, though he couldn't entirely disagree with his son's resentment. Linda swallowed hard. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be." Jacob shoved his chair back, standing abruptly. "This is ridiculous. Dad, you deserve better than this. Mom, you destroyed our family for some jerk." With that, Jacob stormed out of the dining room. Dylan quietly followed him. Emma cast a sorrowful glance at Linda before whispering a quick apology and trailing after them. Linda sat there, staring at her uneaten meal. She looked at Tim, eyes filled with regret. Tim gave her a flat stare, pushing his plate away. "You did this, Linda," he said quietly. Then he rose and walked out, leaving her alone in the echoing silence. 2 nights later, Linda didn't come home. She sent a text to Tim around 6 p.m. "I can't stand being under the same roof when everyone hates me. I'm staying at a friend's place tonight. I'll return for my stuff later." Tim read the message multiple times, a storm of relief and fury churning in his chest. He hated how easily she ran to Tony or whoever else, but also felt freed by her absence. Emma noticed her mom's empty place at the breakfast table the next day. "She left again, didn't she?" Tim nodded. "She says she's staying with a friend." Emma pursed her lips. "Probably Tony." "Dad, how are you really doing?" Tim exhaled, rubbing his neck. "Not good, but at least I don't have to see her face every morning." Jacob called Tim from his drive home. The older son's voice was filled with concern for his father. Dad, you thinking of filing for divorce? Tim hesitated. I might, but I want to see if your mother comes to her senses. At the same time, I can't see how we move past this. Jacob cleared his throat. If she wants Tony, let her have him. But you shouldn't keep letting her walk all over you. If you need a lawyer, I know someone. Tim thanked him, unsure if he was prepared to take that step yet. When Tim hung up, he let the phone rest on the kitchen counter. The back door was open, letting in a cool breeze from the yard. He gazed out, remembering the countless summer barbecues, birthday parties, and quiet evenings he and Linda had shared under those trees. It all felt so far away now. As the day wore on, Tim found himself thinking less about saving the marriage and more about how to protect himself and perhaps even the kids from Linda's choices. His mind drifted to the house deed, which was in his name before their marriage, to the 401k accounts, his grandmother's inheritance. He wasn't a vengeful man by nature, but the bitterness gnawing at him fed new thoughts. If she wants out, I'm not going to make it easy for her. He carefully gathered financial documents, sifting through property records, bank statements, retirement accounts. His anger hardened into a quiet resolve. Linda had chosen to betray him. Now he would do everything in his power to ensure she reaped the consequences. At that moment, the phone buzzed. A text from Linda. We need to discuss living arrangements and finances soon. Tim stared at the message, a grim smile curling his lips. Yes, he thought. Yes, we do. Tim awoke the next morning with a clear objective. Protect himself and maybe exact a little payback. He'd never thought of himself as someone who'd stoop to revenge. Yet here he was, rummaging through his bedside drawer for the business card a coworker had given him ages ago. Janet Wild, family law attorney. He clutched the card, memorizing the phone number. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, painting stripes of light across the bedroom floor. He grabbed his phone and, after a moment's hesitation, dialed. Wild Law Offices, a crisp female voice answered. Hi, Tim said slowly, voice raw. I'd like to make an appointment with Janet Wild. I'm looking at a potential divorce situation. The earliest appointment was 3 days away, so Tim filled the time by organizing documents. He set up a makeshift war room in the den, sorting through old bank statements, mortgage papers, and an itemized list of assets. Emma looked in on him once, her brow furrowed. Dad, are you sure about all this? She pointed at the spreadsheets he'd created. Tim sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I just want to be prepared. If your mom wants a divorce, fine, but I'm not going to be left high and dry. Emma pulled out a chair and sat across from him, her eyes soft. I understand. Still, it feels surreal, doesn't it? Tim offered a sad smile. Yeah, but reality doesn't care about how we feel. On the second evening after Linda left, Tim sat in the living room with the TV off, lost in thought. The front door clicked open, and in walked Linda, her expression a mix of guilt and defiance. She wore a loose sweater and jeans, her hair disheveled. She dropped a small suitcase by the door. I came back for some of my clothes. I hope that's okay. Tim nodded curtly. It's your house too, Linda, but if you're planning to stay tonight, you can use the guest room. She seemed wounded by the coldness in his voice, but said nothing. Emma lingered at the top of the stairs, watching silently. Linda made her way upstairs, returning after a few minutes with a stuffed duffel bag. She paused near the living room as if waiting for Tim to say something more. He didn't. She opened her mouth, hesitated, then spoke in a trembling tone. I know you're angry. You have every right. I'm sorry. He stared at her for a moment. Linda, I don't know what you want me to say. If you're expecting me to welcome you back with open arms, that's not happening. She nodded, tears threatening to spill. I might stay at my friend Brooke's place for a bit. Not Tony's, if that matters. Tim's jaw tightened. He didn't bother asking who Brooke was. Suit yourself. She lingered a moment longer, then left, the front door closing softly behind her. Late that night, Tim's cell buzzed. He thought it might be Linda again, but a different number lit the screen. He answered, half expecting a wrong number. Hello? A low male voice spoke. Is this Tim Wilson? Yes. Who is this? There was a pause. I'm a friend of Tony Fletcher. I think we should talk. Tim's pulse quickened. Why would I need to talk to Tony's friend? The voice grew quieter, almost conspiratorial. Let's just say Tony isn't who he pretends to be. If your wife is involved with him, you might want to know a few things. A swirl of conflicting emotions hit Tim: anger, curiosity, suspicion. I'm listening. Meet me tomorrow night at 8 p.m. by the Redwood Diner parking lot. I'll be waiting in a black Honda. Before Tim could ask more, the line went dead. He stared at his phone, adrenaline pumping. A stranger claiming Tony wasn't who he seemed. This might be a trap or a twisted attempt to manipulate him. Still, Tim felt drawn to any chance of gaining leverage or insight. The next day, Tim arrived at his office with more tension than usual. He worked in an IT department for a manufacturing company, a place typically removed from drama, where employees stared at computer screens and sipped coffee. But that morning, Tim felt like a man on a mission. As he settled into his cubicle, his coworker Emily M. Royce leaned over the partition. She was in her early 30s, sharp-witted, with auburn hair clipped back and stylish glasses perched on her nose. You look like you hardly slept, Em observed. Tim grimaced. That obvious, huh? She nodded sympathetically. Everything okay at home? Tim hesitated, not wanting to spill personal details, but something about Em's gentle tone made him open up at least partially. Let's just say my wife and I are going through some issues. I might need a family lawyer. Em raised her eyebrows, concern evident. Tim, I'm sorry. If you need a recommendation, my sister works at a law firm, but she does mostly real estate. Thanks, but I already booked an appointment with Janet Wild. Good choice, Em said, giving him a half smile. Janet's tough as nails, from what I hear. She patted the top of the cubicle wall. If you ever need to talk, I'm here. Tim thanked her, feeling a surge of gratitude. Having a coworker who at least listened eased the burden slightly. That evening, Tim drove to the Redwood Diner with his heart pounding. The parking lot was mostly empty. Under a flickering streetlight, he spotted a black Honda with tinted windows. He parked a few spaces away, turned off the engine, and paused. Is this stupid? Could it be dangerous? Yet he climbed out, determined to see it through. Approaching the Honda, he tried to catch a glimpse of the driver. A figure in a dark hoodie rolled down the passenger window. Mr. Wilson? Tim forced a steady tone. Yeah, who are you? Name's Travis, the man said, beckoning Tim closer. Hop in. Tim glanced around the deserted lot, then slid into the passenger seat. A strong smell of cigarettes and aftershave hit him. Travis's face was partly hidden by the hoodie, but Tim could see stubble along a hard jaw. Travis handed him a manila envelope. Pictures, phone records, you name it. Tony Fletcher's got a rap sheet, DUIs, debt issues, even a restraining order from an ex. Tim's chest tightened. Why are you giving me this? Travis shrugged. Tony owes me money, and he's messing around with your wife. Figured you deserve to know he's a scumbag. Tim opened the envelope, flipping through photos of Tony leaving bars late at night, arms around different women. A summary of court documents referencing domestic disputes and financial trouble. The man had a history of violence. This is disturbing, Tim muttered. Linda has no idea about any of this. Travis snorted. Tony's a master manipulator. He'll tell people what they want to hear. I've been waiting to see him crash and burn. Now maybe this can help you protect yourself. Or your kids. Tim swallowed, feeling both horrified and oddly vindicated. I don't know what to say. Just watch your back, Travis said, starting the engine. Tony might be charming, but he's dangerous when cornered. Tim nodded, stepping out. The Honda peeled away, leaving Tim in a swirl of dust and confusion. Tim drove straight to a small cafe on the outskirts of town and parked under a street lamp. In the privacy of his car, he thumbed through the documents again. Tony's shady past made Tim's skin crawl. He felt a protective rage simmering. How dare this jerk come into my life and wreck my marriage? He decided to call Jacob, the son who had the strongest reaction so far. Dad? Jacob's voice was cautious. Everything okay? Not exactly, Tim replied. Listen, I got some intel on Tony. He's got a record. DUIs, abuse, restraining orders. This is serious. Jacob was silent for a moment. Jesus, Mom's in deeper than I thought. Do you think she knows? I doubt it, but I'm not sure she'll believe me if I bring it up. Jacob's voice hardened. We can't let him hurt her or any of us. Even if she made a terrible choice, we can't let some violent guy cause harm. Tim's eyes burned with unshed tears. I know. I just wish it didn't have to come to this. My appointment with the lawyer is in 2 days. After that, I'll confront your mom with the facts if she doesn't step forward first. Jacob exhaled sharply. All right. Keep me posted, Dad. I'll do whatever I can. Meanwhile, Dylan, unaware of Tim's new findings, was having his own internal battle. He was a graduate student working part-time at a research lab. Late that same night, he called Tim. Dad, can I come by tomorrow? Dylan asked, sounding torn. I need to talk to you about something. Tim agreed, suspecting Dylan might have heard further rumors. The next afternoon, Dylan arrived. He wore a gray hoodie, shoulders slumped. The moment he stepped inside, Tim noticed the worry etched on his face. They sat in the living room, Tim leaning forward. What's going on, son? Dylan ran a hand through his dark hair. Dad, I've been reading a lot about infidelity, psychological impacts, all that. I know you're dealing with enough, but... He paused, voice trembling. I love Mom, but I can't believe what she's doing. Am I supposed to hate her for this? Because that's how I feel right now. Tim pressed his lips together, taking a moment before answering. It's okay to feel angry. What she did is a betrayal, but she's still your mother. Dylan nodded, tears gathering at the corners of his eyes. I just don't want to regret cutting her out completely, but the thought of her with that guy makes me sick. Tim inhaled slowly. Your mom's made choices that hurt all of us. We can't ignore that, but I won't tell you how to feel. That's something you need to figure out on your own. Dylan wiped his eyes, trying to steady himself. Dad, I'm proud of you for staying strong. If you need me, I'm here. Tim managed a small smile. I appreciate that, son. More than you know. Finally, the day of Tim's appointment arrived. He'd dressed in a crisp button-down shirt, wanting to feel prepared. The Wild Law offices occupied a sleek building downtown. Tim's stomach fluttered as he rode the elevator to the 7th floor. The receptionist greeted him politely, and within minutes, Tim found himself in a glass-walled conference room across from Janet Wild. She was in her late 40s, with short, ash-blonde hair and a sharp gaze that radiated competence. Mr. Wilson, she began, tapping a pen on her notepad. What brings you here today? Tim took a breath, laying out the situation. Linda's affair, the text messages, the confrontation, the potential for divorce. He handed over a summary of assets, plus the manila envelope from Travis about Tony's past. Janet's expression darkened as she read through the documents. I see, she said, setting them aside. The good news is, you have a strong case for protecting your assets, especially if the house was yours prior to marriage and you have evidence of misconduct on your wife's part. The more complex area is the emotional distress and how you want to approach custody issues if there were younger children involved. But your kids are adults, correct? Tim nodded. Yes, they're adults, so custody isn't a concern. Janet scribbled a few notes. Now, if your wife is involved with someone potentially dangerous, we might consider a restraining order, but only if you feel threatened. How do you want to handle this? Tim hesitated. He felt a swirl of anger, heartbreak, and a desire to ensure Linda understood the consequences of her betrayal. I want to safeguard what's mine, he said quietly. And I want to make sure she feels the impact of what she's done. Is that possible without it getting ugly? Janet's lips curled into a half-smile. Divorce is almost always ugly, Mr. Wilson, but we can do it strategically. If your wife tries to push for a big settlement, we highlight her affair and Tony's record. That might reduce her leverage. Are you willing to go that route? Tim nodded, steeling himself. Yes, I am. Leaving the law office, Tim felt a mix of grim satisfaction and soul-crushing sadness. Divorce was becoming a very real possibility. He stepped into the bright afternoon sun, blinking away the sting of tears. At his car, his phone buzzed. Another text from Linda. I feel terrible. Can we please meet and talk about next steps? He stared at the screen, mind swirling with Janet's words, with the photos of Tony, with the heartbreak of his children. "Talk about next steps," she said, as if they were negotiating a real estate contract, not a marriage. He tapped out a reply. "We can meet tonight at 7. I'll come by the house." He needed to maintain the upper hand, now calm, collected, and in control. That evening, Tim drove home, not entirely sure what to expect. When he opened the front door, Linda was there in the living room, standing awkwardly. She'd changed into a simple sweater and jeans, her hair tied back. "Tim," she breathed, eyes red. "Thank you for coming." He set his briefcase by the couch, keeping his posture stiff. "Let's just get this done, Linda. You said you wanted to talk about next steps." "Fine," she swallowed. "I'm not going to lie, I know it looks bad. I'm staying at Brooke's place for now, but that's not sustainable. And Tony," she paused, voice faltering. "Tony and I don't know if it's going to work out." Tim frowned. "Are you saying you want to come back?" She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I want a chance to fix things if that's even possible." He studied her face, searching for any sincerity. "Why the change of heart? Tony not so perfect after all?" She winced. "He has issues, a drinking problem, anger problems. I didn't see it at first, or maybe I ignored the signs." Tim's pulse thrummed. The information from Travis flickered through his mind. "You ignored a lot of things, Linda, including the fact that you were destroying our family." She hung her head. "I know. I was selfish. I wish I could take it all back." He could feel a rush of anger under his ribcage, but he kept his voice steady. "You expect me to just open the door and say, 'Welcome home, honey. Let's forget you cheated on me'?" Linda shook her head, tears flowing freely now. "No, I know that's not realistic. But maybe we could go to counseling, or we could separate for a while instead of divorcing. I just don't want to lose my family entirely." Tim stared at her, remembering how she'd told him she was in love with Tony. Now the tide had turned because Tony was a disappointment. It felt insulting, like she was using him as a fallback plan. He took a step back. "I don't have an answer for you right now. Let's say we separate, legally, and see if that changes anything." Linda's eyes widened, clearly not expecting this direction. "Separate? I guess that's fair. Can I at least see the kids?" Tim ground his teeth. "They're adults, Linda. They'll decide if they want to see you. But yes, we can figure out a schedule for you to visit." She nodded slowly, as if a weight pressed down on her. "All right. I'll do whatever it takes. I really am sorry." He didn't respond. Instead, he walked to the door, picking up his briefcase. "I'll talk to my lawyer and have some papers drawn up. We'll go from there." As Tim left, the house felt heavier than ever. But he also felt the faint spark of satisfaction that he was orchestrating the terms now. Linda had shattered the trust, and if she wanted any scraps of normalcy back, she'd have to abide by his rules. He spent the night at a small motel, not wanting to be under the same roof as Linda. In the cheap, musty room, he flipped through the envelope again, letting each photograph of Tony's misdeeds fuel his resolve. She wants to fix things now that he's not perfect? The very thought made Tim's jaw clench. This would be a long, drawn-out process, but Tim was determined to ensure Linda felt the full weight of her betrayal. 2 weeks passed in a blur of legal paperwork and tense phone calls. Tim was living between a motel and crashing at Jacob's apartment occasionally. Linda stayed at Brooke's place, though Tim had yet to meet this so-called friend. Emma hovered in a kind of limbo, dividing her time between supporting Tim and trying to maintain some semblance of normal life. Late on a Wednesday afternoon, Tim found himself back in Janet Wild's office. She glanced up from the new paperwork he'd just handed her a draft of the separation agreement. "Mr. Wilson," she said, flipping through the pages. "This outlines your proposed terms for separation rather than an outright divorce, giving you both 6 months to cool off, so to speak." Tim nodded. "Linda claims she wants to fix things. I don't see how, but I'm willing to give it some time on my terms." Janet set the papers aside. "We'll file this with the court. In the meantime, do you anticipate any financial requests from your wife?" He shrugged. "She might. She's still working, but her job is tied to Tony in a sense." Janet pursed her lips. Yes, Tony Fletcher. I looked into that man's background after you showed me those documents. He's trouble. Tim swallowed, a cold pit forming in his stomach. So I've heard. She scribbled a note. We'll keep that on record in case Linda tries to claim anything that suggests Tony's issues contributed to the breakdown of the marriage. If she tries to spin the narrative, we'll be prepared. Tim managed a grim nod. As he left the building, a swirl of relief and dread mingled in his chest. Back at the motel room he currently called home, Tim was surprised to find Emma waiting in the parking lot, leaning against her car. She wore a light jacket despite the chilly wind, arms folded over her chest. "Dad," she said softly as he approached, "I came to check on you. I asked the front desk which room you were in." He gave her a tired smile. "I appreciate it, honey. Sorry this place isn't much to look at." Emma shrugged. "Doesn't matter. How are you? Any progress?" Tim motioned for her to follow him inside. The room was small, with a single bed, a tiny table, and a flickering overhead light. Emma glanced at the pile of files stacked on the table. He sighed. "I talked to Janet. We're filing for a 6-month separation. Maybe your mom will want to finalize a divorce after that, or maybe she'll keep insisting she wants to come back." Emma nodded, a flicker of sympathy in her brown eyes. "I called Mom yesterday," she admitted, hands twisting. "She's upset, but she won't give me details. She just says she messed up big time and needs space." Tim grunted. "Space is easy to have when you're the one who caused the problem." Emma reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "Dad, whatever happens, I'm here. Dylan and Jacob are too. We might not agree on how to handle Mom, but we all love you." Tim felt a lump in his throat. He brushed back a stray tear, forcing a weak chuckle. "Thanks, sweetie. That means a lot." A few days later, Dylan called Tim to share an update on his own life. "Dad," he said, excitement lacing his voice, "my lab project got approved for a bigger grant. It's a huge deal." Tim couldn't help but smile. In the midst of all this chaos, hearing good news from one of his kids was a welcome break. "That's awesome, son. I'm proud of you." Dylan hesitated. "I want to celebrate with you and maybe Emma this weekend. Jacob's a maybe, but I'd like you to come out to my campus. They're having a little reception." Tim considered it, realizing he hadn't spent quality time with Dylan in ages. "I'd love to. Let me know the details." Meanwhile, Linda's world with Tony was crumbling faster than she admitted to anyone. Late one night, Tim's phone lit up with a call from an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Tim, it's Linda," came a hushed, frantic voice. He tensed. "Linda, whose phone is this?" She sniffled. "It's Brooks. I left Tony's apartment. He was drunk. We fought. He threw a beer bottle at the wall. I just ran out." Tim's heart pounded. Despite his anger, a protective instinct kicked in. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you?" She let out a shaky sigh. "No, I'm fine physically. But I'm terrified. I had no idea he was this unstable." Silence hung between them. Tim exhaled slowly. "Linda, I warned you. Everyone warned you. Tony's no good." She sniffled again. "I know, I'm sorry. I need a restraining order or something. I'm afraid he might come after me." Tim clenched his jaw. "Call the police, Linda. That's the first step." She gulped. "Right. Brooke is urging me to. I'm sorry for everything, Tim." He didn't reply, the phone line crackling quietly with unspoken tension. Eventually, Linda whispered a goodbye and hung up, leaving Tim staring at the darkness of the motel room ceiling. That weekend, Tim drove out to Dylan's campus. It was a sprawling university with old brick buildings and tree-lined walkways. Emma rode with him, the two making small talk about Dylan's achievements. When they arrived at the science building, Dylan greeted them in the lobby, wearing a crisp button-down shirt and sporting a proud smile. "Dad, Emma, thanks for coming." Tim hugged him. "Wouldn't miss it." They strolled through a small exhibit showcasing the lab's research on renewable energy. A few professors mingled, sipping coffee and chatting. Emma found a seat in the corner while Dylan introduced Tim to some faculty members. One professor, Dr. Eunice Garrett, an elegant woman in her 50s, shook Tim's hand. "Dylan's been a key part of our project. His contributions have been invaluable." Tim glanced at his son with pride. That's wonderful to hear. After the brief ceremony, the group disbanded, drifting into casual conversation. Tim and Emma followed Dylan to a campus cafe. Over hot chocolate and pastries, Dylan asked, "Dad, what about Mom? Did she say anything about coming?" Tim hesitated. "No, she's dealing with Tony, or rather it's complicated." He paused, choosing his words carefully so as not to overshadow Dylan's moment. "She's fine, physically." Dylan grimaced. "I still can't believe she threw away everything for that guy." Emma placed a hand on her brother's arm. "Let's not let it ruin tonight, okay? This is your celebration." Dylan nodded, but his eyes held a glimmer of sadness. "Yeah, you're right. Thanks for being here, both of you." A couple of days later, Tim was tidying up his motel room when Jacob called. His son's voice buzzed with tension. "Dad, do you have time to meet up? Sarah and we need to tell you something." Tim felt his chest tighten. "Sure. Where?" They agreed on a small Italian restaurant near Jacob's place. Tim arrived early, waiting in a booth with a glass of water. Jacob and Sarah walked in together, hands clasped. Sarah gave Tim a polite smile. She was a gentle person, with honey-blonde hair and a warm demeanor that balanced Jacob's intensity. When they sat down, Jacob wasted no time. "Dad, we want to push up our wedding date. Originally, we planned for next summer, but with everything happening in the family, we decided maybe it's best to do it sooner." Tim blinked. "I see. So how soon are we talking?" Sarah glanced at Jacob, then spoke softly. "We were thinking about late fall. It's short notice, but we'd keep it small." A swirl of emotions hit Tim, excitement for them, but also a pang of sorrow that Linda might not be part of it. "That's wonderful, you two. I'm happy for you. Are you inviting your mom, Jacob?" Jacob's jaw tightened. "I haven't decided. After all she's done, I'm not sure I want her there." Sarah squeezed his hand. "It's a difficult position. We don't want to cause more drama, but it's our wedding. We want it to be a day of joy, not tension." Tim nodded slowly. "I understand. This is your wedding, your choice." Jacob exhaled. "We just wanted you to know first, before we make any official announcements. I'm not sure how Dylan or Emma will take it, or Mom for that matter." Tim sipped his water. "They'll probably understand. And as for your mom, well, that's up to you to decide." Jacob and Sarah exchanged relieved smiles. Tim couldn't help feeling grateful that amid the chaos, life was moving forward in some way. Later that night, Tim was woken by his phone buzzing. The motel room's neon clock read 2:13 a.m. He grabbed the phone, fearing bad news. An unfamiliar male voice came through. "Mr. Wilson?" "Yes, who is this?" he asked, heart pounding. "This is Officer Randall with the local PD. We have your wife, Linda Wilson, here at the station. She asked us to reach out to you." Tim sat upright, adrenaline surging. "Is she okay?" "She's not injured, but she's in distress. She claims Tony Fletcher attempted to break into her friend's place tonight. She'd like you to come down here." Tim rubbed his face. He didn't want to be Linda's guardian, but she was still the mother of his kids. "I'll be right there." He threw on clothes, hopped into his car, and sped to the station. When he arrived, Linda was seated on a plastic chair near the front desk, eyes swollen from tears. An officer stood nearby, arms folded. She looked up as Tim approached, relief flooding her face. "Tim," he exhaled. "What happened?" She swallowed, voice shaky. "Tony showed up, drunk. He pounded on the door, yelled that if I wouldn't come out, he'd break in. Brooke called the cops. By the time they arrived, Tony was gone, but they're looking for him." Tim glanced at the officer, who nodded. "We took Linda's statement. We'll be filing an incident report. If Tony contacts her again in a threatening manner, we can escalate to a restraining order." Linda clutched Tim's hand in instinctive gesture. He froze, not sure how to respond, then gently withdrew his hand. "I'm sorry this happened. Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight?" She nodded, wiping her eyes. "Brooke said it's okay for me to come back, but I'm terrified." He sighed. "Then get a restraining order, Linda. Tony's dangerous." She nodded weakly. "Will you drive me back to Brooke's place?" Tim hesitated, but ultimately agreed. During the drive, Linda broke down, sobbing into her hands. "I ruined everything, Tim. And now Tony, he's out of control." Tim gripped the steering wheel. staring at the dark streets ahead. A slow anger burned in him, not just at Tony but at Linda's choices that led them here. But he kept his voice calm. All you can do now is face the consequences and protect yourself. When they reached Brooks, Linda looked at him with trembling lips. "Thank you." He nodded, then watched her hurriedly unlock the door, slipping inside. "Thank you," he repeated silently. For what? For not abandoning her in the face of her mistake? Or for the comfort she no longer deserved? Over the next week, Tim's interactions with Linda were limited to text messages about the separation paperwork. She tentatively mentioned seeing a counselor, possibly going to therapy. Tim kept replies short, focusing on logistics. Meanwhile, Janet Wild informed him that Linda's attorney had reached out, saying Linda was amenable to a separation. No mention of divorce yet, Janet's note read. But be prepared. Tim felt an odd satisfaction. Linda had recognized that Tony was trouble, tried to come crawling back, and now was stuck in limbo. Part of him pitied her. Another part wanted her to feel every sting of regret. He occupied his time with work, refusing to let the situation consume him entirely. M. Royce, his coworker, occasionally checked on him, offering a listening ear. He accepted her kindness gratefully, though he remained guarded about the personal details. One afternoon, as Tim was updating some server settings, M popped her head around the cubicle again. "Hey, I'm grabbing lunch. You want to come with?" For a moment, Tim considered. A lunch out would break the monotony. He nodded. "Yeah, that sounds nice. Thanks." They ended up at a small sandwich shop near the office. They chatted about harmless topics, company gossip, a new software update, until M gently brought up his situation again. "Any progress on the separation?" Tim shrugged, taking a bite of his turkey club. "We're in a holding pattern. She's dealing with Tony's meltdown. I'm just waiting." M tilted her head sympathetically. "I'm no therapist, but sometimes it helps to talk it out with someone who's not in the family." Tim gave a weak smile. "I appreciate it. Maybe I'll take you up on that one day." That evening, Tim returned to his motel room, balancing a fast food bag and a soda. As he approached his door, he thought he saw a figure standing near the far corner of the parking lot, partially lit by a flickering lamp. A surge of unease swept over him. He paused, squinting into the dim light. The figure wore a dark jacket, possibly a hood, standing still as if watching. Tim's pulse quickened. Could that be Tony? Or someone else? He fumbled for his key, hurrying to unlock the door. Once inside, he locked both the knob and the deadbolt, heart hammering. He peeked through the window blinds, but the figure had vanished. "Get a grip, Tim," he told himself. But a chill lingered. Tony Fletcher was still at large, apparently unhinged. If Tony had discovered Tim's location, things could escalate quickly. Tim grabbed his phone, pondering if he should call the police. Then he recalled Travis's envelope, the warnings about Tony. He decided not to bother the police without concrete evidence. Instead, he made a mental note to check out of the motel soon. Unable to sleep, Tim stayed up drafting notes on everything that had happened. He wrote down each incident with Tony, Linda's confessions, the threats, the text messages. He felt like a detective building a case. This can't go on forever, he thought, sipping lukewarm coffee. Sooner or later, Tony would be found by the cops or attempt something desperate. Linda might end up pinned between Tony's wrath and her own guilt. Tim added a final bullet point to his notes. Confront Tony? A bold step, but maybe if Tim faced him directly, he could end this madness, or it could provoke Tony to do something worse. A knock at the door startled Tim, causing him to spill coffee on the motel desk. He jumped up, heart racing. "Who is it?" "It's the night manager," came a muffled voice from outside. "Is everything okay in there?" Tim blinked, opening the door a crack. The manager, a thin man with a weary expression, eyed him suspiciously. "Your lights have been on for hours and I heard some noise. Just wanted to check." Tim exhaled. "I'm fine. Thanks for checking." The manager nodded, glancing down the hallway. "Okay. Let us know if you need anything." Tim closed the door, pressing his back against it. Paranoia, he thought. But maybe that's exactly what kept him safe. A pale sunrise broke across the horizon as Tim pulled out of the motel parking lot with a single suitcase in the trunk. He'd checked out early, deciding that living in fear wasn't sustainable. He had enough savings for a short-term rental. Janet had suggested a friend who owned a small guest house on the outskirts of town. On the drive over, he dialed Emma. She picked up on the second ring, her voice groggy. "Dad? It's like 6 a.m. Are you okay?" "Yeah, sorry to wake you," Tim said, eyes on the empty road. "Just letting you know I'm moving into a guest house for a while. The motel didn't feel safe." Emma yawned. "Do you want me to help you move stuff?" Tim smiled at her concern. "I appreciate it, but I just have a suitcase. Don't worry about it. Go back to sleep." She murmured a tired "okay" and hung up. Tim glanced at his phone, noticing a missed call from Linda in the middle of the night. No voicemail, just the record of her attempt. He decided he wasn't ready to return that call. The guest house was a charming little cottage behind a larger country home, owned by an older couple named the Hensleys. They'd agreed to rent it short-term, no questions asked. Mr. Hensley greeted Tim at the front gate, giving him a quick tour. "Bedrooms in the back, living room here, small kitchenette," he said, flipping on lights. The place smelled faintly of wood polish, and dust motes swirled in the morning sun. "We're not around much, but if you need anything, just knock on the main house door." Tim thanked him, setting his suitcase on the worn couch. A wave of relief hit him. No prying eyes here, no neon sign blinking outside his window. Just a quiet refuge. He sent a quick text to Jacob and Dylan, letting them know his new address, then set about stocking the kitchenette with basic groceries he'd picked up along the way. Around midday, as Tim was settling in, a knock rattled the guest house door. He froze, setting down a cereal box. He wasn't expecting anyone. Cautiously, he looked through the small peephole. Linda stood outside, disheveled, hugging her arms against the slight chill. He sighed and opened the door a crack. "How'd you find me?" She bit her lip. "Emma told me you found a new place. I asked her for the address." Tim stepped aside, letting her in. She glanced around the simple interior, a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "So this is where you're staying now?" He nodded. "Yeah, you need something?" She exhaled shakily. "Tony's been calling me again, leaving voicemails, threatening to show up at my office." Tim stiffened. "Have you told the police?" She shook her head. "They said there's not much they can do until he actually violates the protective order I filed. They just told me to be cautious." He ran a hand across his forehead. "And you want me to do what exactly?" She looked up at him, tears brimming. "I don't know. Help me. I'm scared. And I can't turn to Tony anymore, obviously. Brooke's letting me stay, but I feel like a burden." Tim let silence fill the space. "Help me." The words rattled in his mind. She had thrown their marriage away, and now she came to him, frightened because her new lover was unhinged. Part of him screamed to turn her away, let her deal with the fallout alone. Another part, the one that once loved her, couldn't leave her vulnerable. "Linda," he said slowly, "I'm not living in our old house. I'm not your safety net right now. If Tony is threatening you, do what you should have done in the first place. Get professional help, keep the police informed, and stay away from him." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You're right. I'm sorry for barging in." He sighed, stepping back. "Look, just be careful, and don't bring Tony here. I'm warning you." She managed a faint, shaky smile. "Understood." That same evening, a call from Dylan jolted Tim out of a half-doze on the couch. "Dad," Dylan said, voice urgent. "Mom just texted me that Tony showed up at her office parking lot, but he left when security was called." Tim sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Is she okay?" "She's shaken. Jacob's on his way to check on her. They're going to file a more formal complaint, I guess." Tim felt a swirl of conflicting emotions, fear for Linda, anger at Tony, frustration that he was still drawn into the chaos. "All right, keep me posted. And you stay safe, too." Dylan's voice softened. "I will, Dad. I love you." Tim closed his eyes. "Love you too, son." 2 days later, Travis, the man who'd first given Tim the damaging envelope on Tony, contacted Tim again. This time by text. "Got new info. Tony's on the verge of skipping town. He owes a bunch of money. Could get desperate." Tim stared at the text, a sick feeling in his gut. If Tony was desperate, it might mean he'd try to grab Linda or threaten her for money. Tim typed back a brief acknowledgement, dread coiling in his stomach. He stepped outside the guest house for a breath of fresh air. A gentle breeze rustled the tall grass, and he tried to steady his racing thoughts. Amidst the chaos, Tim had nearly forgotten about Jacob and Sarah's upcoming wedding plans. One evening, Jacob called, sounding both excited and nervous. "Dad, we booked a small venue for next month. Sarah's parents are helping us organize. I'd like you to be my best man." Tim felt a surge of emotion. "Me? I'd be honored, son." Jacob hesitated. "We decided not to invite Mom, not after everything. I just can't handle that scene." Tim swallowed. "That's your decision. She might be hurt, but it's your wedding." Jacob sighed. "Yeah, I'm sure Emma and Dylan will understand. By the way, do you want to bring a guest or a—" Tim chuckled mirthlessly. "No, I'm not seeing anyone. I'm just focusing on cleaning up this mess." Jacob murmured an understanding response. Then they ended the call. Tim leaned against the kitchen counter, feeling the weight of the battered family he had. Linda excluded from Jacob's wedding, she really did lose everything. Late one night, Tim was in the guest house, reading over separation papers again, when a loud bang rattled the door. His pulse lurched. He flicked on the porch light and peeked through the curtain. Tony Fletcher stood outside, swaying unsteadily, a wild look in his eyes. Tim's heart pounded. How the hell did he find me? "Wilson!" Tony yelled, voice slurred. "Open the damn door!" Tim dialed 911 on his phone, pressing it to his ear. As it rang, he tried to keep his voice calm. "Tony, you need to leave!" Through the door, Tony spat a curse. "You ruined everything, you and Linda! She's pressing charges! She's ignoring my calls! You think you're better than me, don't you?" Tim forced a steady tone. "I'm calling the police! Get out of here before you make it worse!" He heard Tony kick the door with a heavy thud. Tim backed away, heart hammering. The 911 operator came on, and Tim quickly explained the situation. She assured him officers were en route. Tony pounded again, rattling the small guest house. "Linda was mine, and you took her away." Tim clenched his jaw. The irony burned. He took Linda from me, not the other way around. But he kept silent, gripping his phone. The sound of sirens in the distance seemed to inflame Tony further. He roared, slamming his fist into the door again, cracking the thin wood. Tim pressed himself against the wall, adrenaline surging. Red and blue lights splashed across the windows as two patrol cars screeched to a halt outside the fence. Officers rushed forward, shouting orders. "Hands up! Step away from the door!" one officer yelled. Tim heard the scuffle of feet, a burst of curses from Tony, and then a thud as he was presumably tackled. Tim exhaled a shaky breath, relief flooding him. A few minutes later, there was a knock this time, a firm, authoritative rap. Tim opened the door to an officer shining a flashlight. Behind him, Tony was in handcuffs, being led to a squad car, still shouting expletives. The officer asked Tim a series of questions. "Did Tony break anything? Did he threaten you?" Tim answered truthfully, explaining the entire incident. By the time Tony was driven away, Tim felt a wave of exhaustion. He slumped down on the couch, noticing his trembling hands. This was it, the confrontation I dreaded. His phone buzzed Jacob calling. Tim answered, voice still shaking. "Tony showed up. The cops took him away." Jacob swore under his breath. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, just shaken." Jacob let out a sigh of relief. "That guy's insane. I hope he stays locked up." Tim nodded, a heaviness settling in. "Me too." The next morning, Linda showed up at the guest house again, eyes red and puffy, her hair pulled into a loose bun. Tim opened the door, stepping outside to speak with her on the small porch. She rubbed her arms, her breath fogging in the early morning air. "I heard Tony got arrested last night." Tim folded his arms, nodding. "He showed up here, drunk and angry." She shuddered. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that. I really am." He regarded her carefully. She looked genuinely shaken. "So now you see how dangerous he is. Are you going to testify if the cops press charges?" She swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, I'll do whatever it takes to keep him away. I never thought it would go this far. I was so stupid, Tim." His jaw tightened. "Yeah, you were." Tears welled in her eyes. I know I've lost you, and I don't blame you for hating me, but I'm so sorry. Tim closed his eyes briefly, remembering the love they once shared. Everything was different now. I don't hate you, he said in a measured tone, but I can't pretend this never happened. You shattered my trust. You turned our family upside down. She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. I understand. They stood there for a moment, the air thick with regret and sadness. Finally, Tim spoke again, voice barely above a whisper. Jacob's wedding is next month. He's not inviting you. Her face fell, pain evident. I was afraid of that. I deserve it. Tim didn't disagree. You made your choices. Now you deal with the fallout. She gave a choked sob, turning away. I wish I could turn back time. He watched her walk down the path and disappear around the corner. Part of him ached for the woman he used to know. The rest of him felt drained, as if the final threads holding them together had snapped. Inside the guest house, Tim found a sense of calm settling over him. Tony was in custody. Linda was finally facing the consequences of her betrayal. Jacob's wedding loomed, a bright spot in the chaos. Dylan and Emma were forging their own paths, though the family ties had been strained almost beyond repair. Tim pulled out the separation papers once more. A single signature from Linda, and everything would be official for the 6-month trial. But a nagging voice in his mind suggested maybe he should push for a full divorce now. Why wait? His phone buzzed with a message from Janet Wild. Tony Fletcher is being held on attempted break-in and harassment charges. Linda might leverage this in negotiations. Let's keep the separation route for now and finalize details soon. Tim sat down, shoulders heavy. He pictured Linda's tear-stained face, the fear that Tony inflicted. She'd brought it on herself, but he didn't relish watching her suffer. He just wanted closure to end this chapter and move on. Outside, the sun rose higher, casting warm light through the guest house windows. Tim took a deep breath. He was exhausted, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a hint of hope. A slow, painful hope, but hope nonetheless. Tim Wilson woke to the steady drip of rain on the guest house roof. It had been a week since Tony's arrest outside his door, and Tim felt like his life was in limbo. He wasn't exactly free, there were still legal matters, the 6-month separation arrangement with Linda, and the question of whether or not to push for a full divorce. On the bright side, Tony being in custody at least provided Tim and his family a temporary sense of safety. Yet the tension still simmered. Linda sent frequent texts about Tony's bail hearings, about her own guilt, and about possible therapy. Tim gave short, factual responses. He had no intention of letting his guard down, not after everything that had happened. That morning, Tim was sipping lukewarm coffee by the kitchenette window when his phone buzzed with an unknown local number. He nearly ignored it, expecting another debt collector for Tony or some telemarketer. But curiosity got the better of him. Hello? A calm female voice answered. Hi, this is Dr. Miriam Lawson. I'm a licensed counselor here in town. I'm calling on behalf of Linda Wilson, who requested a joint session with her estranged husband if you're open to it. Tim's heart gave a slow thump. She did? Yes. Linda says you're separated but considering therapy. Is that accurate? He paused. Part of him wanted to reject the idea outright. Another part acknowledged that facing Linda in a structured environment might bring closure or at least clarity. I'm surprised she reached out, but I'll think about it, he finally said. Dr. Lawson's tone remained polite. I understand. Let me know if you'd like to schedule something. Here's my number. Tim jotted down the info and hung up, staring at the small scrap of paper. Linda actually trying therapy was new. Maybe she's serious, he thought. Or maybe she just wants to look good for the courts. Still, the notion lingered in his mind. He set the note aside and grabbed his jacket, deciding to visit the main house to see if Mr. or Mrs. Hensley needed anything. Stepping outside, Tim found the rain had subsided to a light drizzle. The Hensleys' large farmhouse stood a short walk away, a path lined with soggy leaves leading up to the wraparound porch. Tim liked the quietness of this property, a perfect hideaway from the chaos. Mr. Hensley greeted him at the screen door. Morning, Tim. Everything okay in the guest house? Tim nodded. All good, just checking in. Mrs. Hensley, a petite woman with silver hair, appeared behind her husband. "You settling in all right?" she asked kindly. Tim smiled. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you both for renting it to me on short notice." They exchanged pleasantries about the weather and local news. Tim learned they'd been married 40 years, mostly happily. The conversation was pleasant, but reminded Tim of what he'd lost a spouse he once thought he'd grow old with. He bid them goodbye and trudged back to the guest house, the note with Dr. Lawson's number weighing on his mind. That afternoon, Tim's son Dylan called from campus. "Dad, guess what? Our lab's research got featured in a national journal." Tim felt a rush of pride. "That's incredible, son. Congratulations." "Thanks. Listen, we're having a celebratory gathering next week on campus. The dean will be there. I'd love for you to attend." Tim's heart lifted at the idea of focusing on something positive. "Count me in." A brief pause. Then Dylan's tone shifted. "Also, I ran into Mom yesterday." Tim frowned. "Where?" "At the grocery store by campus. She was picking up a few things. She looked rough, but she said she started therapy. I didn't ask details. It's just weird seeing her like that, like she's a shell of herself." Tim exhaled. "She's dealing with the fallout from Tony, plus everything else. I guess therapy might help." Dylan sounded unconvinced. "Yeah, maybe." He cleared his throat. "Anyway, see you at the event next week?" "Absolutely," Tim said, smiling. "Can't wait." They hung up, leaving Tim with mixed emotions. Linda's infiltration into the children's day-to-day life was inevitable, but it always felt like a looming reminder of their shattered family. Jacob called later, finalizing the date for his wedding to Sarah, 3 weeks away. Tim agreed to help with some logistical details, including booking a block of rooms for out-of-town relatives. The short timeline meant a lot of rushing around, but Jacob sounded determined. "One more thing, Dad," Jacob said, voice carefully neutral. "Mom texted me about the wedding. She said she understands if she's not invited but wants me to know she's sorry." Tim tried to interpret his son's tone. "How do you feel about that?" Jacob let out a long breath. "Still angry. Part of me wants to let her come, but I can't forget what she did and how she almost brought that maniac Tony into our lives." Tim nodded. "I'm not going to tell you what to do. It's your decision." Jacob paused. "Sarah and I talked. We've decided to keep it strictly Dad's side for parental figures. Mom can have a relationship with me later if we both decide, but not at the wedding." It hurt Tim to imagine Linda's heartbreak, but she'd laid the groundwork for this outcome. "I understand, son. Just be sure you won't regret it later." Jacob let out a soft scoff. "I'll deal with that if it comes." The next day, Tim found himself standing outside a small mental health clinic. Despite his hesitation, he'd called Dr. Lawson and arranged a one-on-one meeting to see if there was any point in joint therapy with Linda. He was greeted by a soft-spoken receptionist and then ushered into Dr. Lawson's cozy office. A diffuser emitted a light lavender scent, and a plush armchair faced the counselor's desk. Dr. Lawson, a tall woman with dark braids, stood to shake Tim's hand. "Mr. Wilson, welcome. Please, have a seat." Tim settled into the armchair. "Thank you for meeting me." She offered a calm smile. "Linda mentioned you might be reluctant, but she also said you used to be open-minded. I'm not here to pressure you, just to help if I can." Tim folded his hands. "I appreciate that. I just don't know what there is left to salvage. She betrayed me, my kids are furious, and her affair partner turned out to be dangerous." Dr. Lawson nodded empathetically. "Betrayal can feel insurmountable, but therapy can sometimes bring clarity, even if you decide not to continue the marriage." Tim stared at the carpet. "I guess that's what I'm after, clarity." They spoke for nearly an hour, Tim describing his confusion, the swirling anger and grief. Dr. Lawson listened attentively, occasionally asking pointed questions. When the session ended, she handed Tim a business card. "If you decide to come in with Linda, let me know." Tim walked out feeling mentally drained but oddly lighter. Maybe I do need this, he thought. That evening, Tim returned to the guest house to find an excited voicemail from Emma. "Dad, call me back ASAP. I have news." He dialed her number. Emma answered in one ring, practically squealing, "I got accepted into a graduate program overseas." Tim's jaw dropped. "Overseas? Where?" "London. It's a one-year program in social work. I've always wanted to travel, and it's a fantastic program, Dad." He felt a rush of pride and an ache at the thought of her moving so far away. "Emma, that's incredible. You sure about this?" "I've never been more sure," she said, a grin apparent in her voice. "The only snag is finances, but there are scholarships. I'll figure it out." Tim laughed softly. "I'm sure you will. Congratulations, sweetheart." He hung up, heart brimming with pride. Even in the chaos, life kept moving forward for his children. The next day, Linda texted Tim, "I know you talked to Dr. Lawson. Would you be willing to try a joint session? If not, I understand." Tim stared at the message for a full minute. Then, surprising even himself, he typed back, "I'll do one session, just to see." Linda replied almost immediately, "Thank you. I'll schedule it. Please let me know what times work." His stomach fluttered with a mix of dread and curiosity. Part of him wanted to see if Linda was serious about changing. Another part wanted to confirm there was truly nothing left between them. 2 days later, Tim found himself in Dr. Lawson's office again, but this time Linda sat across from him. She looked worn down, eyes puffy as if she'd been crying. Gone was the confident demeanor she once wore when she ran off with Tony. In its place was a palpable sorrow. Dr. Lawson opened gently. "Linda, would you like to start?" Linda swallowed hard, glancing at Tim with obvious remorse. "Tim, I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to understand that I truly regret what I did. Tony seemed like an escape from my feelings of loneliness, and I made an unforgivable mistake. I never expected him to become violent." Tim's voice was tight. "So I was just not enough for you? Or was it about the excitement?" Linda bowed her head. "I think it was about me feeling stuck, not addressing my own issues. Tony offered attention, flattery. I was selfish." Dr. Lawson intervened. "Tim, how do you feel hearing that?" He let out a slow breath. "Angry, sad. It's like she blew up our family on a whim." Linda choked out a sob. "I deserve that anger." They spent nearly an hour dissecting the betrayal, Linda's misguided choices, and Tim's internal conflict whether to push for divorce or remain separated. Dr. Lawson guided them through emotional exercises, asking Linda to detail her plans for change. Continued therapy, complete transparency, severing contact with Tony permanently. In a quiet moment, Tim finally said, "I'm not sure I can ever trust you again, but I see you're trying. That's more than you did before." Linda's lips quivered, tears on her cheeks. "It's the least I can do." After the session, Tim and Linda stepped into the clinic's hallway. For a brief moment, they just stood there, the tension still thick. Linda wiped her eyes. "I appreciate you agreeing to do this. I know it won't fix everything." Tim shoved his hands in his pockets. "No, but at least I'm not walking away feeling I never gave you a chance to speak." She gave him a fragile smile. "If you ever want to talk again, you know where to find me." He nodded non-committally. "I'll let you know." With that, they parted ways, each heading to separate cars, separate lives. Jacob's wedding was in a week. Tim spent his days shuttling between finalizing the separation papers, dealing with work obligations, and fielding calls from Janet Wild, his lawyer, about potential timelines for turning the separation into a divorce if that's what he chose. One afternoon, Tim stopped by a tuxedo rental place for a final fitting. He was meeting Jacob there. They greeted each other with a firm hug despite everything. Father and son still had that solid bond. "How are you holding up, Dad?" Jacob asked, studying Tim's face. Tim managed a half smile. "I'm okay. Met with Linda in therapy. It's complicated." Jacob shook his head. "Don't let her reel you back in, Dad. She'll just hurt you again." Tim sighed, fiddling with the tuxedo sleeve. "I'm cautious. It's more about closure than reconciliation." Jacob nodded thoughtfully. "As long as you know what you're doing. Sarah and I have your back, you know." Tim patted his son's shoulder. "I appreciate that." That night, Tim was reviewing a final checklist for the wedding when a call came from Linda's number. He hesitated, then answered. Yeah? Her voice trembled. Tony's posting bail. The police told me he's likely to get out in a few days. Tim gripped his phone. What? Are you safe? Linda swallowed. I'll stay with Brooke. I don't think he'll come after me, but I'm still scared. He's unpredictable. Tim forced calm into his voice. Tell the police if he contacts you. Don't open the door if he shows up. Keep a record of everything. She mumbled a thank you and hung up. Tim set his phone down, adrenaline surging. This is the last thing we need right before Jacob's wedding. 2 nights before the wedding, Tim found himself unable to sleep. He went for a drive, eventually ending up near the old family home he once shared with Linda. It was dark, the windows lit by a single lamp. According to the separation agreement, Linda technically had the right to move back in, but she'd chosen to remain with Brooke, letting the house sit mostly empty. Tim parked across the street, memories flooding him. The kids playing in the yard, barbecue gatherings, Linda welcoming him home from work. It felt like another lifetime. He saw a figure step onto the porch, a neighbor perhaps, or the caretaker checking on things. Tim didn't linger. He drove off, a bittersweet ache in his chest. The morning of Jacob's wedding arrived. Tim woke early in the guest house, feeling oddly hopeful despite the looming shadow of Tony's bail. He got dressed, carefully handling the tuxedo. Today was about Jacob and Sarah, about forging a new path for the family. At the venue, a small countryside inn with a charming garden, Tim helped with last-minute decorations. Emma and Dylan arrived, both looking sharp. Guests trickled in. The atmosphere hummed with anticipation and a dash of nerves. Jacob and Sarah had chosen a modest ceremony under a floral arch. Tim took his place beside his son as best man, trying not to think about Linda, who was notably absent. But as the officiant began to speak, Tim felt gratitude that, despite the heartbreak, his children were forging forward in life. Midway through the vows, a commotion rippled near the entrance. Tim turned, heart lodging in his throat. Tony Fletcher's shirt untucked, eyes wild, stood by the gate. He'd found them. Jacob stiffened, Sarah visibly paled. Emma and Dylan gawked in horror. The guests murmured in alarm, some stepping away. Tim's pulse hammered. How did Tony know about this wedding? Tony stumbled forward, slurring. Where's Linda? She's not answering my calls. I know she'd be here for her kid's wedding. Tim stepped in front of Jacob protectively. She's not here, Tony. You need to leave. Tony sneered, eyes bloodshot. You all ruined my life. Linda's run off. The cops were after me. Jacob glared. You did that to yourself. Get out. Anxious guests scrambled to call the police as Tony advanced further. I want answers, he shouted, voice cracking. Linda was mine. Before he could finish, Tim grabbed Tony's arm in a firm grip. Back off. This is my son's wedding. Tony wrestled free but wobbled, clearly intoxicated. 2 of Jacob's friends rushed over, ready to restrain him. Tony swung wildly, missing Tim but knocking over a chair. The officiant halted the ceremony, eyes wide. In the distance, sirens blared. The gate burst open and local officers ran in. Tony, hearing the sirens, tried to flee, but an officer tackled him against the garden fence. Gasps and murmurs swept through the crowd as Tony was cuffed, raging and cursing. Jacob's face was set like stone. Sarah trembled, tears in her eyes. Tim, heart pounding, took a shaky breath. The day of celebration had nearly been destroyed by Linda's old lover. Once Tony was dragged away in a patrol car, the guests regrouped, though the atmosphere was rattled. Jacob and Sarah huddled with Tim. I'm so sorry, Tim whispered, voice raw. I never thought he'd show up. Jacob shook his head, putting an arm around Sarah. It's not your fault, Dad. Tony's just a lunatic. Sarah, still blinking back tears, said, We can try to keep going. Or do we postpone? Jacob glanced at the guests, who'd gathered anxiously by the arbor. No, we're here. Let's finish what we started. Tim felt a rush of admiration for his son's resilience. Let's do it, he agreed. They returned to the front, and the officiant resumed the ceremony. Though shaken, the couple exchanged heartfelt vows. Applause broke out when Jacob kissed the bride, a moment of genuine joy overshadowing the earlier chaos. Tim exhaled, tears in his eyes. Despite everything Tony's intrusion, Linda's betrayal, Jacob and Sarah got their wedding. Perhaps that was the only victory Tim needed right now. That evening, after the reception wound down, Tim sat on the inn's veranda, gazing at the moonlit garden. The wedding had ended on a triumphant note, but Tony's appearance left everyone on edge. His phone buzzed Linda. He braced himself and answered. "Yes?" Her voice was shaky. "Jacob told me what happened. Is everyone okay?" Tim nodded, even though she couldn't see. "Yeah, Tony was arrested again. If he makes bail this time, I'll be shocked." Linda sighed, anguish evident. "I'm so sorry. God, I never meant for any of this. I wish I could have been there for Jacob's wedding, but I understand." Tim's chest tightened. "It worked out in the end. Jacob and Sarah are married now." A long pause. Then Linda whispered, "I'm starting to see how deep my mistakes go. I'm truly sorry, Tim." He closed his eyes, letting the cool night air wash over him. "I know," he said quietly, "but apologies can only do so much." Linda sniffled. "I'll sign the final separation papers. I won't fight you. You deserve to move on." Tim felt an unexpected wave of relief. "Thank you," he said, voice hushed. They ended the call. Tim stared up at the stars. Jacob was married, Tony likely facing more jail time, and Linda finally accepting the separation. The future felt uncertain, but at least it was a step forward, a quiet, bittersweet step toward healing. 2 weeks after Jacob's wedding, life settled into a cautious rhythm for Tim. Tony remained in jail, charged with violating a protective order, trespassing, and attempted assault at the wedding. Linda, though relieved, navigated the weight of guilt and shame. The separation papers were nearly complete. Janet Wild called Tim on a Monday afternoon. He was at work, hunched over a database issue when his cell buzzed. He stepped out to the hallway to answer. "Mr. Wilson," Janet said in a confident tone. "Linda's lawyer contacted me. She's ready to finalize the separation. It can remain a 6-month legal separation or convert to divorce if that's what you want." Tim leaned against the wall, heart thumping. "So it's up to me now?" "In many ways, yes. If you decide to push for a full divorce, we can file, citing infidelity and irreconcilable differences. Given everything that's happened, the court would likely grant it promptly." He swallowed. "I need a bit more time, but I'm leaning that way." Janet's voice softened. "Take your time. But remember, once you choose, we'll proceed swiftly." That evening, Emma stopped by the guest house for dinner, rummaging through Tim's modest pantry. She was bright-eyed, a travel brochure for London peeking out of her handbag. "Dad, I'm flying out in 2 months," Emma announced between bites of takeout noodles. "I want to have a small going-away party with you, Dylan and Jacob. Even Mom, if she can handle it." Tim nearly choked on his food. "Your mom? Are you sure?" Emma sighed. "I know it sounds nuts, but I want one night where we can pretend we're still a family. No Tony, no lawyers, no drama, just dinner, if we can manage that." Tim frowned. "Emma, I'm not sure if that's wise. What if things blow up again?" She gave him a determined look. "Then they blow up, but at least I'll have tried. Once I go overseas, who knows when we'll all be together again." Tim exhaled. Emma was stubborn but well-intentioned. "I'll be there if your brothers agree. And Linda, well, that's up to her. Just be prepared for awkwardness." Emma nodded, a small smile forming. "Thanks, Dad." The next day, Tim drove out to Dylan's campus to catch the tail end of a seminar Dylan was hosting. Afterward, they grabbed coffee in a bustling campus lounge. Dylan slumped into a chair, swirling a caramel latte. "So, Emma told me about this farewell dinner idea. She also asked if I'd be okay seeing Mom there." Tim studied his son's expression. "And what did you say?" "I said yes, but only if Mom truly respects boundaries. If she tries to guilt-trip us or spin her sob story, I'm leaving." Tim sighed. "Fair enough. It'll probably be tense." Dylan fiddled with his coffee sleeve. "Dad, do you think you'll ever forgive her enough to be civil?" Tim paused. "I'm civil, but I don't see us reconciling romantically or living together again. Too much damage done." Dylan nodded, relief flickering across his features. "I think that's the right move, honestly." Later that week, Tim called Jacob to gauge his reaction to Emma's dinner plan. On the phone, Jacob's frustration was clear. "You're kidding, right? he scoffed. We just finished dealing with Tony's meltdown at my wedding. Now Emma wants a family dinner? Tim tried to stay calm. She leaves for London soon. She wants one night to say goodbye properly. Jacob sighed. I love Emma, but I'm not in the mood for any happy family charade. Mom didn't even show up to my wedding well. She wasn't invited. Anyway, we see how that all turned out with Tony. It's too raw. Tim closed his eyes, recalling Tony's chaotic entrance at the ceremony. I know, but it might mean a lot to Emma. A pause. Then Jacob muttered, Fine, I'll come. But if Mom starts preaching regrets, I'm out. Tim thanked him, hanging up. At least they'll all be in one room, he thought grimly. That's progress, maybe. When Emma asked Linda about the dinner, Linda texted Tim. I'd love to come, but I understand if it's too painful for everyone else. Please confirm if Jacob or Dylan are okay with me being there. Tim stared at the message. He typed back succinctly. They're both uneasy, but they've agreed for Emma's sake. Dinner is next Friday at 7, at the old Italian place near downtown. Linda replied, I'll be there, thank you. Tim set down his phone, a chill running through him. This could either be a small step toward healing or a disaster. Days before the farewell dinner, Tim received a call from an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. Wilson, a raspy voice said. Tim's blood ran cold. It was Tony Fletcher. I used my one phone call from jail to reach you. How the hell did you get my number again? Tim snarled, heart pounding. Tony let out a bitter laugh. Doesn't matter. I need to talk. My lawyer says I'm facing serious charges. I might cut a deal, but I need someone to confirm Linda lied about me. Or at least that she knew who I was. Tim's fingers tensed around the phone. Are you trying to blackmail me? I'm not giving you anything. Tony coughed, voice tight with desperation. Linda told me she never wanted to press charges. I know she's spooked. If she doesn't testify, maybe I get a lighter sentence. All I'm saying is convince her. Tim's anger flared. You threatened her. You threatened my family. You showed up at my son's wedding, nearly assaulted people. Why would I help you? Tony fell silent for a moment. I'm out of options. Just think about it. Linda's the only real witness for the big stuff. Without her testimony, I'll walk free. Tim's stomach churned. If you walk free, you'll be right back to terrorizing her. Tony let out a hollow chuckle. I've learned my lesson. Just do me a favor. That's all I'm asking. Tim hung up, hands shaking. The nerve of Tony, expecting sympathy after all this. Yet the phone call left Tim rattled. If Linda refused to testify, Tony might be out sooner than anyone expected. Friday evening arrived. Tim, Jacob, Dylan, and Emma gathered at a small Italian restaurant. The lights were soft, the music mellow. A round table near the back had been reserved, offering them some privacy. Linda entered last, wearing a simple blouse and slacks, eyes flicking over everyone nervously. She murmured a greeting and took the empty seat beside Emma, across from Tim. Jacob avoided eye contact. Dylan offered a polite nod. The waiter came for drink orders and they mumbled requests: water, iced tea, nothing stronger. The silence hung thick as they browsed the menus. Emma cleared her throat. So, thanks for coming, everyone. I know it's awkward, but I really wanted this last dinner together before I leave for London. Dylan mustered a small smile. We're here for you, sis. Jacob's gaze flicked to Linda. So how's therapy, Mom? Linda shifted, caught off guard. It's helping. I'm learning a lot about my issues, the choices I made. I don't expect any of you to forgive me, but I'm trying to be better. Jacob clenched his jaw but said nothing. Emma tried to steer the conversation to lighter topics. Her excitement about London, Dylan's research breakthroughs, and Jacob's newlywed life. Tim observed Linda. She seemed genuinely remorseful, responding softly to the kids' updates. Yet the tension remained. Everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Halfway through the meal, Linda set down her fork, summoning courage. Jacob, I know you have every right to resent me. I just want you to know I regret what I missed at your wedding. I hate that Tony ruined— Jacob's eyes flashed. You brought Tony into our lives. That's what you did. He didn't just show up one day. You let him in. Linda's face fell. I did. I'm sorry. Jacob exhaled sharply, looking at Emma. "I'm sorry, Em. I can't do this. I'm trying, but I can't hear her excuses." Emma pleaded with her eyes. "Jake, please." Dylan placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "Take a second, man." Jacob inhaled, forcing himself to stay seated. Tim cleared his throat, stepping in. "Jacob, it's just one night for Emma. Let her have this." Jacob glared at Linda but didn't leave. The conversation limped on. They chatted about the appetizer, the restaurant's decor, anything but Tony or the betrayal. As dessert arrived, Linda mustered a hesitant smile. "I appreciate you all letting me come. Emma, good luck in London. Dylan, keep rocking the lab. Jacob, I'm proud of the man you are. And Tim, I know we're not going back to what we had, but I'm thankful you gave me some time to at least try to explain myself." Tim nodded, swallowing the knot in his throat. "We survived the dinner," he said, half joking, trying to break the tension. Emma forced a grin. "We did." And just like that, the dinner drew to a close. Emma's dream of a warm, loving family meal never fully materialized, but at least no one stormed out or caused a scene. Outside, the group lingered in the parking lot beneath flickering streetlights. A chilly breeze blew. Emma hugged each sibling. "Thanks, guys," she whispered. "It means a lot." Dylan smiled softly, stepping aside to make a phone call. Jacob gave Linda a curt nod and retreated to his car. Linda approached Tim one last time, voice subdued. "Tony called you, didn't he? He told me he might reach out." Tim's eyes widened. "Yes, he wanted me to convince you not to testify." She sighed, hugging her arms. "I won't back down. I promised the police I'd cooperate." Tim studied her face. "Then he'll probably serve serious time." Linda nodded, tears gleaming. "That's what needs to happen. I owe it to all of you and to myself to ensure he never comes back to hurt anyone." Tim felt a flicker of respect for her resolve. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a folded set of separation documents. "Then let's finalize this, Linda. I think we both deserve to move on." Her lips trembled, but she accepted the papers. "Okay," she whispered, voice barely audible. "I'll sign them." They stood for a moment under the harsh parking lot lights, neither sure how to say goodbye. Finally, Linda gave a faint smile. "Thank you for letting me be here tonight." Tim nodded, stepping away. "Take care." She turned and walked to her car, the silhouette of the woman he once knew disappearing into the darkness. Tim watched Jacob's and Dylan's cars peel out. Emma lingered behind, arms wrapped around herself. She gave Tim a watery smile. "Dad, that wasn't perfect, but it's all I could hope for." Tim gently hugged her. "I'm proud of you. You've always been the peacemaker. I'm sorry it's so messy." She wiped a tear. "It's life, right? Next time we see each other, I hope we're all in a better place." He nodded, feeling that familiar ache as she got into her car. The taillights vanished, leaving Tim alone in the parking lot, the hush of night settling around him. A month passed after Emma's farewell dinner. She flew to London as planned, sending the occasional text and photo of her new environment. Dylan immersed himself in his lab work, and Jacob settled into married life with Sarah. Tim, meanwhile, finalized the legal separation with Linda and teetered on the edge of divorce. One rainy Wednesday, Linda texted Tim about Tony's court hearing. "I'm testifying today. Wish me luck." Tim debated whether to attend. In the end, curiosity and concern nudged him to go. He arrived at the county courthouse, scanning the hallway for Linda. She sat on a bench outside the courtroom, pale and tense. "Tim," she said quietly, seeing him approach. "You didn't have to come." He shrugged. "Just wanted to make sure you're okay." She gave a tight smile. "I appreciate that." They slipped into the courtroom where Tony was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, wrists shackled. He looked thinner, eyes hollow with rage and desperation. Linda took the stand, voice trembling at first but growing firmer as she recounted the break-ins, the threats, his behavior at Jacob's wedding. Tim listened, tension coiling in his gut. Tony's public defender attempted to discredit Linda by implying she'd willingly been with Tony, but Linda kept her composure. She admitted her affair but also made clear that Tony's aggressive actions were never consented to. In the end, the judge ruled that Tony's bail would be revoked due to repeated violations of restraining orders. He was set to remain in custody until trial. As Tony was led away, he locked eyes with Tim, sneering. "All of you did this to me," he hissed. Tim merely stared back, unflinching. Outside, Linda exhaled shakily. "That was intense." Tim nodded. "You did well up there." She glanced at him, uncertain. "Now that Tony's locked away, I can move on. Guess that means you can too." Tim heard the unspoken question. Did this change anything? He forced a neutral tone. "I've already moved on, Linda." Her shoulders slumped, but she managed a nod. "I know." The next day, Tim met Janet Wild in her office, the final separation documents in hand. She flipped through them, then looked up. "It's all here, Mr. Wilson. Are you ready to convert this separation into a divorce filing?" Tim leaned forward, clasping his hands. "I think so. Linda has already agreed not to contest. We talked about it." Janet's eyes flicked with approval. "All right. If you sign here..." She turned a page and pushed it toward him. "We'll file. The court's backlog isn't too severe, so it could be finalized in a month or two." Tim's heart pounded. He took the pen, letting out a slow breath. This is it, he thought. The end of a 23-year marriage. Memories flickered. The wedding day, births of the kids, Linda's smile back when they were young. He forced them aside and signed. Janet stamped the papers with a finality that echoed in the silent room. "Congratulations or condolences," she said gently. "Sometimes it's both." Tim nodded, unable to speak. He stood, shook her hand, and left feeling simultaneously hollow and relieved. 2 weeks drifted by. Tim found a quiet routine at the guest house, working by day, reading or taking walks in the evening. The Hensleys remained friendly but gave him plenty of space. Jacob stopped by occasionally for Sunday lunches, telling stories of married life, how Sarah was adjusting to her new job at a local nonprofit. Dylan invited Tim to a campus open house, where Tim saw a lab demonstration of cutting-edge renewable energy research. Emma sent postcards from London with pictures of the Thames, Big Ben, and the university campus. "Everything's so exciting here, Dad," she wrote. "I miss you guys, but I'm learning so much." Tim kept her postcards pinned on a small board near the guest house kitchenette, each message a reminder that life moves on. At work, Tim's coworker M. Royce continued to show concern. One day she leaned over the cubicle wall, adjusting her glasses. "Hey, some of us are heading to O'Malley's pub after work. You want to come?" Tim shrugged. "I appreciate the invite. Not sure if I'm in a bar mood, though." M tilted her head sympathetically. "Maybe you need a change of pace? It's just a casual thing, some colleagues. Maybe a game of pool." Tim realized he'd been isolating himself. "All right," he agreed, surprising even himself. "Sounds good." That evening, Tim joined M and a few others for drinks. The pub was lively, with old rock tunes playing from a jukebox. They chatted about work drama, upcoming software releases, and weekend plans. Tim felt a certain lightness, as if he was finally part of the world again, rather than on the outside looking in. M approached him at the bar, sipping a soda. "You seem more relaxed tonight," she commented. Tim gave a small smile. "I guess so. It's nice to do something normal." She returned the smile, raising her glass. "Here's to normal." They clinked glasses. Tim felt a flutter of something friendship, maybe the beginning of a spark. He wasn't sure, but it felt good. One late afternoon, Linda texted Tim, "House documents need your signature. I'm transferring my share back to you as we agreed. Could you meet me there tomorrow?" He hadn't stepped foot in their old home for weeks. A wave of nostalgia and unease hit him. Still, he agreed, wanting to finalize the property arrangement. The next day, he arrived to find Linda already inside, flipping through some paperwork at the kitchen table. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes drifting in the stale air. Linda looked up, offering a weak smile. "Hey." Tim nodded in greeting. "So, what do you need me to sign?" She pushed a packet toward him. "It's the quitclaim deed. We agreed I wouldn't fight you on the house since you bought it from your grandmother years before we married. I just want to make it official." He skimmed the pages, then signed where indicated. Setting the pen down, he glanced around the kitchen that once bustled with family meals. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. Linda exhaled. "As okay as I can be, I guess. I'm going to put this place on the market if that's all right with you. Or do you want to keep it?" Tim paused, memories swirling. "I thought you wanted to keep it originally, but you don't?" She shook her head. "Too many ghosts here. I can't live here alone, and you don't either. Might be best to sell, split whatever remains after the legal stuff." Tim nodded, a twinge of sadness. "That's fair." They walked through the empty rooms one last time, both lost in thought. In the living room, Linda stopped by the fireplace mantel, once adorned with family photos. Now it was bare. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, voice hollow. Tim kept his distance. "I know." She turned, eyes wet. "If you ever, maybe next year or two, if you ever feel like talking, just know I'm here." He gave a small nod. "Take care of yourself, Linda." With that, they parted ways inside the hollow shell of their once home. When Tim left, he felt a final sense of closure. The woman he once shared everything with was now merely a memory. Weeks passed into months. Emma settled in London, thriving in her program. Dylan advanced in his research, winning a small grant. Jacob's marriage with Sarah seemed to flourish despite the rocky family backdrop. Tim continued living at the guest house, though he considered finding a modest condo or apartment. He and Linda no longer spoke much outside of logistical matters about the house sale. The divorce was on track, just a matter of time before it was officially granted. One Friday evening, M. Royce texted Tim, "A few of us are trying out that new Greek place. Want to join?" Tim stared at the phone, a small smile tugging at his lips. He replied, "Sure, count me in." He felt a subtle shift inside him, a willingness to embrace a life post-Linda. Maybe he would start dating eventually, or maybe not. But he was free to choose now. At last, the official divorce decree arrived in the mail. Tim sat at the small table in the guest house, the envelope trembling in his hands. He tore it open. Inside, the stark legal text confirmed what he already knew. Tim and Linda Wilson's marriage was dissolved, effective immediately. He stared at the words for a long moment, feeling a punch of finality. There was no dramatic confrontation, no big scene, just a piece of paper that severed a bond once meant to last a lifetime. Yet as he gazed out the window, the late afternoon sun painting the fields in gold, he realized he felt at peace. The heartbreak, anger, and chaos had led him here alive, changed, and maybe even stronger. A week later, Tim found himself at M's invitation in a small group dinner. They'd finished their meal and were sipping coffee under soft lights. M asked Tim about his weekend plans. He shrugged, smiling softly. "I'm not sure yet. Maybe check out an open house for a condo downtown." She grinned. "Home ownership again?" He chuckled. "I guess I miss having my own space that's not a rental. Starting over, you know." M raised her mug in a toast, to starting over. Tim clinked his mug against hers. In that moment, the last strands of bitterness unwound, replaced by a gentle acceptance. Life wasn't perfect, family scars remained, regrets lingered, but there was a chance for new beginnings. He'd come a long way from the night Linda confessed to loving another man. Betrayal, heartbreak, danger, a quiet but determined revenge, he'd navigated them all. Now, with Tony behind bars and Linda's sorrow forging her own path, Tim stood on the threshold of his future, free at last to shape it how he wanted. And in that softly lit corner of an ordinary diner, Tim Wilson allowed himself a small, hopeful smile.
What's up, story lovers? This is the Story Guy, and if you're hungry for crazy tales and mind-blowing narratives, you've come to the right place. Don't forget to smash that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our weekly dose of crazy, cheating stories, fun fiction, and gut-ripping comedy from around the world. But that's not all. We also create our own original stories, and trust me, you won't find these anywhere else. Want even more spine-tingling reads? Head down to the description and grab our exclusive story collections. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.